4 days. That is roughly how long Bahrain's water reserves would last if its desalination plants stopped running. Not 4 months, not 4 weeks, 4 days for a country of 1.6 million people, a country that hosts the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, a country with essentially no natural aquifer left to fall back on. That figure was not leaked by an activist or estimated by a critic. It surfaced in March 2026 during a war in reporting on what happened when the region's drinking water infrastructure stopped being off-limits and started being a target. Now hold that number next to a different one. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund manages assets in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Qatar's is comparable. The Gulf states are, in cash terms, among the richest political entities that have ever existed. And here is the question this episode is actually about. How does a region with that much money end up 4 days from a water emergency? The answer is not that they were careless. The answer is more interesting than that, and considerably more uncomfortable. The Gulf built a working system, genuinely working, for about 50 years, on a resource nobody was counting, an energy subsidy nobody was pricing, and a peace nobody was guaranteeing. All 3 of those assumptions are now under strain, simultaneously. This is an episode about arithmetic, about what happens when a balance sheet has an entry on it that no auditor ever checked. I'm going to build it in 3 layers: what's under the ground, what's in the sea, and what's in the air between the two. Let's start underneath. There is a category of water that most people have never heard of, and it explains more about the modern Middle East than almost anything else you could name. Hydrologists call it fossil water, sometimes paleo water. The concept is simple. During and after the last ice age, the Arabian Peninsula was a different place, wetter, cooler, with monsoon rains reaching deep inland and rivers running where there are now only dry channels. That water percolated into the ground and settled into porous rock formations hundreds of meters down. Then the climate shifted, the rains stopped, and the water stayed put. For 10,000 years, for 20,000. In some formations, more than 30,000. We know this precisely, not approximately, because the water can be dated. Carbon dating on groundwater pumped from parts of the Saudi desert returns ages older than agriculture, older than writing. This is water that was already ancient when the first cities were built in Mesopotamia. Now here's the property that matters, and it's the one that gets lost in most coverage. In a desert receiving under 100 millimeters of rain a year, the recharge rate on these aquifers is, for practical purposes, 0. Nothing meaningful is going back in. Which means fossil water is not a renewable resource being used unsustainably. It is a non-renewable resource being mined, the same category as coal or oil or any other deposit you extract until it's gone. That distinction sounds academic. It is the entire ballgame, because you can manage a renewable resource badly and recover. A mined resource has a flaw, and when you hit it, the story ends. So, how much has been taken out? I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of coverage of this topic overreaches, and I'd rather give you a defensible number than a dramatic one. The precise depletion percentages vary between studies depending on baseline and methodology, and anyone quoting you a confident single figure is smoothing over real scientific uncertainty. But the direction is not in dispute, and the convergence across independent methods is what makes it credible. NASA's GRACE satellite mission measures groundwater by detecting minute variations in Earth's gravitational field, literally weighing the water from orbit. Applied to Saudi Arabia, It clocked depletion at roughly 2 cubic kilometers per year across the period studied. That's the view from space. Now the view from the ground. In the Sac aquifer system, researchers measured water levels falling by an average of over 2 meters per year across an 11-year span, and in some unconfined zones, 3 meters annually. Across parts of the peninsula, water tables have dropped by more than 100 meters. Artesian zones, places where pressure once pushed water to the surface unaided, have simply stopped existing. And the third method, the global comparison. A University of California, Santa Barbara study examined 1,700 aquifers worldwide and found groundwater declining in roughly 71% of them, about 3 times as many as researchers expected. The worst affected category was precisely the arid agricultural region, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Exactly this: satellite gravimetry, physical well measurements, and global comparative study all pointing the same direction. That's how you know it's real, regardless of which specific percentage you prefer. Now, what was all this water actually spent on? This is the part that still strikes me as genuinely remarkable. By the mid-1980s, Saudi Arabia had become a wheat exporter, a country with no permanent rivers, no freshwater lakes, and almost no rain, shipping grain to other countries. You've seen the mechanism from orbit, even if you didn't know what you were looking at. Those perfect green circles stamped across the desert in satellite imagery, center pivot irrigation, each one a wheel of irrigated cropland turning in a place that shouldn't support it. Consider what that trade actually was. They pumped up water that had been sitting underground since before the wheel, poured it onto fields under a brutal sun where much of it evaporated, grew wheat, and sold the wheat abroad. In hydrological terms, Saudi Arabia was exporting fossil water in solid form. It was liquidating a non-renewable asset and booking the proceeds as agricultural revenue. To the kingdom's credit, and this matters because it's evidence they can course correct, they eventually saw it. Saudi Arabia phased out the domestic wheat program in 2016, specifically because the depletion trajectory had become undeniable. That is a government looking at its own data and reversing a flagship policy. Hold on to that. It becomes relevant later. But by then, decades of extraction had already happened. And the reason nobody stopped it sooner is the most important structural point in this entire layer. Aquifer depletion is silent. It doesn't flood a street. It doesn't collapse a bridge on camera. It happens hundreds of meters underground, in a place where literally nobody is looking. And at the surface, everything appears completely normal. The wells produce, the crops grow, the revenue arrives. There is no feedback signal until there is a catastrophic one. Compare that to oil. An oil field that's running down shows up in production figures, in quarterly reports, in share prices. There's an entire global apparatus of analysts watching. Water had no equivalent, no market price that reflected scarcity, no auditor, no analyst class. It was simply assumed. That's the account nobody audited. And that's layer one. If this is the kind of breakdown you're looking for, the structural picture rather than the headline, subscribe to GeoStrata. The next layer is where the strategy comes in, and where the Gulf's solution turns out to have created a new problem. So the groundwater has a flaw. The Gulf knows this. What's the answer? The answer is that you stop taking water out of the ground and start taking it out of the sea. Desalination. And the scale of what the Gulf has built here is genuinely one of the underrated engineering achievements of the modern world. This isn't a story of failure. It's a story of a solution that worked, and then created its own set of dependencies. The numbers. A 2026 study drawing on the diesel data database puts Saudi Arabia's output at around 10.8 million cubic meters of desalinated water a day, approximately 15.6% of all desalination capacity on the planet from one country. Region-wide, roughly 5,000 plants produce something on the order of 40% of the world's desalinated water. Look at the dependency country by country, because the variation tells you who's exposed. Saudi Arabia draws roughly 70% of its drinking water from desalination, Oman around 86%, Kuwait over 90%, the UAE around 42%, lower but against extremely high consumption. And in Bahrain and Qatar, dependency runs close to total. That spread matters enormously, and we'll come back to it, because it maps almost exactly onto who is vulnerable to what. Now, the physics. Desalination is not magic. It is the application of large amounts of energy to force water through membranes or to boil and condense it. Energy is the input, and this is where the Gulf's model reveals its actual architecture. The chain runs like this. Sell hydrocarbons, use the revenue and the fuel to run desalination, and the power grid, use desalinated water to sustain cities that could not otherwise exist at that scale in that geography. Every link depends on the one before it. That's not inherently fragile. Plenty of economies have serial dependencies. What makes it notable is that the whole structure rests on energy staying cheap and abundant specifically for the country producing it. The domestic subsidy is the load-bearing wall, which means the Gulf's water security is not really a water question at all. It's an energy question wearing a water costume. And now the part that turns this from a dependency into a trap. Desalination has a byproduct. You take in seawater, extract the fresh fraction, and you're left with brine, concentrated salt water, which gets pumped back into the sea. Do that at the scale of hundreds of plants in a body of water that is shallow, hot, and slow to exchange with the open ocean, and the salinity of the source water rises. I'm going to be deliberately measured here because the specific figures floating around on this get inflated. Some analyses indicate parts of the Gulf now run meaningfully saltier than typical seawater. What's not disputed is the mechanism and its direction, and the consequence is elegant in the worst way. Saltier input water requires more energy to desalinate, so the process of solving the water problem incrementally raises the cost of solving the water problem. It's a system that gets harder the more you use it. Layer that against the climate trend, and it compounds. The Gulf is already among the hottest seas on Earth, regularly hitting 35 degrees Celsius at the surface. Air temperatures across the southern Gulf are climbing at close to double the global average. Hotter conditions drive water demand up at exactly the same time the sea's rising salinity drives production cost up, so the escape hatch from the aquifer problem turns out to have a meter running on it. That's layer 2. Now the third layer, the one that until March 2026, everyone treated as theoretical. There was an unwritten rule in this region's wars. You do not attack the water. It was never a treaty. It was closer to mutual recognition of consequence. In a region where cities exist only because desalination plants run, destroying those plants means creating a humanitarian catastrophe with no obvious ceiling and no way to control who it hits. Everyone understood the escalation math. In March 2026, that understanding broke. The context, fighting between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other, escalated into open war, beginning in late February 2026, a campaign that expanded dramatically, with strikes reported across more than a dozen countries, and within roughly a week, it reached the water. The sequence, as reported, on March 7th, Iran's foreign minister accused the United States of striking a freshwater desalination plant on Keshem Island in the Strait of Hormuz, saying supply to around 30 villages was disrupted. The United States denied carrying out the strike. Reporting a month later indicated the plant was still out of service. On March 8th, the following day, Bahrain accused Iran of damaging one of its desalination plants in a drone attack, describing the strike as indiscriminate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Bahrain's Electricity and Water Authority stated that supply to residents was not actually interrupted. Over the following days, further incidents were reported. A power and water facility in the UAE, plants in Kuwait, and a strike near Dubai's Jebel Ali port that reportedly landed close to a dense cluster of desalination units. Iran denied some of these and attributed them elsewhere. I want to be precise about what's established and what isn't. Both sides denied the strikes attributed to them. The attributions are contested. What is not contested is that multiple desalination facilities across the Gulf sustained damage during this period, and that the taboo, whoever broke it, is now broken. On the law, this is unambiguous. Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions explicitly protects drinking water installations from attack. Intentional strikes on such facilities can constitute war crimes under the Rome Statute. A water expert at the UN University Institute described attacking infrastructure civilians depend on that heavily as absolutely a war crime, and pointedly said it applies to either side. But the strategic revelation was bigger than the damage, because what these strikes did was force the reserve figures into public view. And those figures are the reason we opened this episode where we did. Bahrain, roughly 4 days of reserves if desalination stops. Qatar, genuinely unclear. Official sources at one point indicated reserves covering months. Other analyses put the municipal figure closer to 7 to 10 days. That gap is itself informative. Outside observers cannot verify the real number. The UAE, a tiered strategy, with reserves reportedly covering as little as 2 days at normal consumption, extending to weeks only under progressively severe rationing. Kuwait, higher reserves on the order of 10 to 15 days by some estimates. Now go back to that dependency spread from Layer 2 and watch it line up. The states with near total desalination dependency and minimal reserves, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, are precisely the states with the thinnest margin. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with more storage, more redundancy, and more geographic depth, are meaningfully better positioned. This is the strategic point, and it's worth stating plainly. The Gulf's water vulnerability is not uniform. It's concentrated, it's specific, and it's now demonstrated rather than theoretical. A country like Bahrain doesn't face a slow crisis unfolding over decades of aquifer decline. It faces a fast one, measured in hours, dependent entirely on whether a small number of coastal facilities keep running on a given morning. The taps run until they don't, and the gap between those two states is much shorter than the skyline suggests. Now, I've spent 20 minutes building a fairly grim structural picture, and it would be easy to end there. But that would be lazy, and it would be wrong, because there's a real case on the other side, and it deserves proper weight rather than a disclaimer. Here it is. First, they can course correct, and they've proven it. The 2016 wheat phase-out is the exhibit. That was a flagship policy, a matter of national pride, food self-sufficiency, and the Saudi government killed it because the hydrological data said it was insane. That's not the behavior of a state in denial. Saudi Arabia's national water strategy is now pushing hard on treated wastewater reuse and managed aquifer recharge, which are exactly the right instruments. Second, the science says recovery is physically possible. This is the finding that gets almost no coverage, and probably should. Research monitoring Saudi Arabia's largest fossil aquifer system found that in specific regions, following policy changes and a couple of unusually wet years, depletion trends actually reversed, measurably. That does not mean the peninsula refills, it emphatically does not. But it does mean the system isn't a one-way ratchet everywhere, and that management changes register in the data. Third, the technology curve is real. Desalination energy intensity has fallen substantially over the past 2 decades and continues to. Pair falling energy cost per cubic meter with the solar resource the Gulf has in absurd abundance, and the hydrocarbon dependency at the heart of the chain becomes decouplable in principle. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both building at serious scale on this. Fourth, the UAE's reserve strategy is exactly the correct institutional response to the vulnerability the 2026 strikes exposed. And it was built before those strikes, not after. Somebody in Abu Dhabi ran the scenario and acted on it. So the honest position is not the Gulf is doomed. It's narrower and harder. The Gulf has the money, increasingly has the technology, and demonstrably has the analytical capacity. What it has not yet demonstrated is the ability to consistently overcome the political obstacles to using them. And that brings us to the case immediately to the north, where you can watch precisely that failure play out in real time. Iran is the natural experiment. Same climate zone, same aquifer physics, same drought exposure, different governance, and a decisively worse outcome. In November 2025, President Masoud Pezeshkian said something heads of state do not say, that if rain didn't arrive, Tehran, metropolitan population, around 15 million, might have to be evacuated. He went further, stating Iran had no choice but to eventually relocate the capital because the central plateau was becoming ecologically unviable. The numbers behind that: Tehran's 5 main reservoirs down to around 11% of capacity, with individual dams lower. The Latvian dam near 9%. 19 major dams dry nationwide. In Mashhad, a city of roughly 3 million, supply reservoirs around 3%. 6th consecutive drought year. Lowest recorded rainfall in the 2025 water year since records began. Here's why this is a control case and not just a parallel disaster. The temptation is to file Iran under climate change and move on. The hydrologists who study it refuse to let you. Kaveh Madani, who directs the UN University's Water Institute and previously served as deputy head of Iran's own Department of Environment, so he is not an outside critic, calls Iran's condition water bankruptcy, and he is explicit that the failure must not be climatized. His phrase, his argument, is that blaming the sky is politically convenient precisely because it's exculpatory. It points attention away from decades of over-extraction and governance failure, and the record backs him. Iran drilled approximately 1 million wells. Roughly half are illegal. It built over 600 dams in a construction spree of frequently questionable utility. And it abandoned the Qanats, an underground gravity-fed tunnel network, 2,000 years old, UNESCO recognized, which tapped groundwater at rates the system could actually sustain and let it recharge. Iran traded a technology that worked for 2 millennia for one that broke in 50. And then the political layer. Analysts at CSIS and others identify politically connected actors, including construction arms tied to the Revolutionary Guard, as controlling water-intensive projects, which produces the diagnostic fact of the whole case. Reforming Iranian water management would require confronting entrenched interests that profit from the current arrangement. So it doesn't happen. The analysis exists. The capacity exists. The reform doesn't. The physical consequences are now irreversible in the strict sense. Pump groundwater from beneath a city faster than it refills, and the ground compacts. Subsidence. Parts of the Tehran region have been recorded sinking by tens of centimeters annually. Roads crack, foundations tilt, voids open. And critically, once that ground compacts, the aquifer's capacity to ever store water again is permanently reduced. You don't just drain the tank, you crush it. That's the lesson Iran offers the Gulf. And it's not, this could happen to you. The Gulf states have more money, more storage, and, on the evidence of 2016, more willingness to act on their own data. The lesson is narrower and sharper. The constraint is never the analysis. It's whether the political system can act against its own beneficiaries. Iran had world-class hydrologists telling it exactly this for years. It has the reservoirs at 11% anyway. So let's close the balance sheet. 3 layers, 3 assumptions, all of them now under strain at once. Under the ground, an asset that was mined rather than managed silently for 50 years with no price signal and no auditor, and which, in the strict physical sense, cannot be replaced. In the sea, a solution that works, that they've built at genuinely world-leading scale, but which is chained to cheap domestic energy and which incrementally degrades its own source water as it runs. In the air, a piece that was quietly load-bearing the entire structure, and which, in March 2026, stopped being reliable, with 4-day reserve figures now on the public record for anyone doing targeting analysis. And here's what money cannot do, which is the thing worth sitting with. A sovereign wealth fund can buy desalination plants. It can buy solar. It can buy storage, redundancy, and the best hydrological consultants on Earth. What it cannot buy is 30,000-year-old water once it's been pumped out and evaporated over a wheat field. It cannot uncompact subsided ground, and it cannot purchase the political will to charge citizens for water they've been trained for 3 generations to treat as free. That last one is the actual binding constraint, not the geology, not the technology. Every real solution, cutting water-intensive agriculture, pricing water at cost, breaking the grip of politically connected water interests, runs directly into someone powerful who benefits from the current arrangement. Saudi Arabia cleared that bar once in 2016, and it was notable precisely because it's rare. Iran hasn't cleared it at all, which is why I'd argue this story is badly misfiled. It gets covered as an environmental story. It isn't. Environmental stories are about nature. This is a story about institutions, about whether states can act on information that's inconvenient to the people who fund them. The desert is just the thing keeping score. And one final point, because it's the reason this belongs on a geopolitics channel rather than a climate one. Western governments have spent 50 years building the entire apparatus of Middle East strategy around one resource: oil, strategic reserves, naval deployments, alliance structures, war plans, all of it oriented around hydrocarbons. But oil has substitutes. There are alternatives, workarounds, technologies, other suppliers. That's what makes it a commodity. Water has no substitute. Nothing else does what it does. And when the next serious crisis comes out of this region, there is a real chance it won't be about the resource everyone is watching. It'll be about the one that was draining quietly, underground, off every balance sheet for 50 years, while everyone counted the barrels. So the question I'd put to you is, the Gulf's problem solvable? They have the money, the technology's improving, and they've shown at least once they can act against their own interests when the data demands it. Or is the political constraint the permanent one, the thing that makes this end the way it's ending in Tehran, just slower and with better financing? Make your case in the comments. And if you want more of this, structure over headlines, subscribe to GeoStrata.